Our MSNBC breaking news coverage of the situation in Iraq continues. President Obama confirmed a short time ago that he ordered a humanitarian mission in Iraq today and that it has been carried out. Escorted by F-18 fighter jets, U.S. military cargo planes have successfully dropped food, water, and medicine in the Sinjar mountain area where thousands have fled and are now trapped by the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria militants. 40,000 Yazidis, a small Kurdish-speaking religious sect, fled to northern Iraq after ISIS threatened to execute anyone who did not convert to Islam. ISIS blocked the roads. As many as 25,000 children now have no access to food or water. At least 40 have died so far from dehydration and the extreme heat. President Obama met with his national security team in the Situation Room earlier today and spoke just moments ago.
Today I authorized 2 operations in Iraq. Targeted airstrikes to protect our American personnel, and a humanitarian effort to help save thousands of Iraqi civilians who are trapped on a mountain without food and water and facing almost certain death. Let me explain the actions we're taking and why. First, I said in June, as the terrorist group ISIL began an advance across Iraq, that the United States would be prepared to take targeted military action in Iraq if and when we determined that the situation required it. In recent days, these terrorists have continued to move across Iraq and have neared the city of Erbil, where American diplomats and civilians serve at our consulate and American military personnel advise Iraqi forces. To stop the advance on Erbil, I've directed our military to take targeted strikes against ISIL terrorist convoys should they move toward the city. At the request of the Iraqi government, we've begun operations to help save Iraqi civilians stranded on the mountain. As ISIL has marched across Iraq, it has waged a ruthless campaign against innocent Iraqis. And these terrorists have been especially barbaric towards religious minorities, including Christian and Yazidis, a small and ancient religious sect. Countless Iraqis have been displaced, and chilling reports describe ISIL militants rounding up families, conducting mass executions, and enslaving Yazidi women. In recent days, Yazidi women, men, and children from the area of Sinjar have fled for their lives. And thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, are now hiding high up on the mountain with little but the clothes on their backs. They're without food, they're without water, people are starving, and children are dying of thirst. Meanwhile, ISIL forces below have called for the systematic destruction of the entire Yazidi people, which would constitute genocide. I've said before, the United States cannot and should not intervene every time there's a crisis in the world. So let me be clear about why we must act and act now. When we face a situation like we do on that mountain, with innocent people facing the prospect of violence on a horrific scale, when we have a mandate to help, in this case a request from the Iraqi government, and when we have the unique capabilities to help avert a massacre, then I believe the United States of America cannot turn a blind eye.
Joining me now live from the White House is NBC News White House correspondent Kristen Welker. Kristen, what is your understanding of the way this decision unfolded today at the White House?
Well, the meeting started here very early, Lawrence. President Obama meeting with his national security team. And, of course, as you just heard the president mention, they were discussing the request and the calls for the U.S. to intervene, not only from the Iraqi government, but also from lawmakers on Capitol Hill, from other countries who were urging the United States to do something to deal with this humanitarian crisis. And I think what is key and what the president said, Lawrence, you heard him use the term genocide. That really framed much of the thinking here behind the scenes at the White House. This idea that it was incumbent upon this president, upon this administration to do something to try to prevent what could be a genocide, to prevent another Rwanda. What is also key, Lawrence, and these meetings, by the way, continued throughout the day here at the White House, was a determination about how this could be carried out in a targeted way, so that if, in fact, the United States does decide to move forward with those airstrikes that President Obama said are right now contingent upon the actions of the extremist forces, that any military action would be targeted and would be limited. And of course, you heard the president reiterate the fact that there will be no U.S. boots on the ground. But as we've been discussing here all night long on MSNBC, it is difficult once you engage militarily to guarantee that it is in fact targeted and limited. And so I think that is why you're hearing the caution from the president, but also strong words of warnings to the extremists. I also can tell you, Lawrence, I just learned that the chief of staff here, Dennis McDonough, did reach out to House Speaker John Boehner to brief him on the decision that was made here tonight and the decision to make those airdrops to drop food and water to help those 40,000 people who are stranded on top of that mountain in northern Iraq. Lawrence?
Kristen, please stay with us if you can, as
Absolutely.
we're joined by also now by former U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, Christopher Hill, and Reuters investigative reporter David Rohde. Ambassador Hill, what do you think is within the reasonable realm of the possible for the U.S. on this mission?
Well, certainly, I think the humanitarian mission will certainly help. Unclear how much it can help, but it will help those people that are currently trapped up there. Secondly, I think they can, with this threat of airstrikes, dissuade any ISIL formation from attacking Kurdish lands in Erbil. You know, the Kurds have a lightly armed but well-trained and pretty well-disciplined force known as the Peshmerga. So I think airstrikes in support of that force could in fact deter ISIL from attacking Kurdish lands. Now, beyond that, hard to say, and I think you always have to ask the question, and then what, when you've used military force, because it appears that nobody is prepared to go into Nineveh, into the center of Nineveh, and push the ISIL out of that province or out of Anbar. So we have a serious regional problem, which goes well beyond the issue of governance in Baghdad. And to be sure, the U.S. has tried to make clear that we would like to hear about a new government and a prime minister not named Maliki, but that may still be a long way off. So we're going to have to be facing some decisions while people in Baghdad have not yet made their decisions.
Just want to add a footnote here for the audience who are hearing many in the news media say ISIS. We heard the president and just now Ambassador Hill say ISIL. ISIL is the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, which is their chosen name. In the media, it's frequently referred to as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, the more modern the country name now for that area. David Rohde, we have these people on the top of a hill who are surrounded by people who want to murder them if they come down. The president is trying to solve that problem, but they have to come down sometime, presumably.
Excellent question, and that's the problem. So he's framed this, to me, very interestingly in terms of genocide. He's not talking about going to war against the Islamic State because they're a terrorist threat to the United States. He's saying we're going to save these people. How do you save them with no boots on the ground? Clearly, the Iraqi forces aren't strong enough to go in there and get them out. And it's sort of, he's being very careful and he's restricting this effort, and that's smart. But I'm not sure most Americans are going to understand the end goal here and how we get there, because he's framed it this way.
Yeah.
And people are tired of the war on terror, but they kind of, is this genocide argument going to work for the American public?
Ambassador Hill, we did see ISIL deterred from moving on Baghdad. We've seen them kind of detour once before. This seems like a harder place to get them to move out of. Now we're actually trying to get them to move away from a position they're already in.
Well, again, I think we can deter them from the Kurdish areas of Iraq. Right now, they're about 30 minutes from Erbil. I think they can be pushed back from there. I think the problem is right now they are very well established in western Iraq, in these provinces of Anbar, Nineveh, and parts of other provinces. And there the question is, how are they going to be pushed back? I think the Obama administration has put a lot of faith in the idea that a new government in Baghdad will kind of rally everybody and put people together. But when you see some of the names emerging, nothing really is terribly inspiring. And so I suspect that's going to go on for quite a while. And meanwhile, this group, this caliphate, if you will, is going to be more and more established. And I think it has a regional dimension to it. I think it could bring on more regional tensions, including the Sunni-Shia tension. So I think it's something that we probably, along with some other allies, including the French perhaps, maybe the Brits and maybe the Turks, we're going to have to be making some decisions.
David, as much as the president is obviously moved and disturbed by what's going on with the Yazidi people, they're being trapped and all that, he has Americans right there in Erbil, right nearby, like 40 miles away from where this is happening. He has State Department personnel, he has military personnel there, and they require his absolute top priority for protection. And it seems to me, although there was an awful lot of emotional weight in the statements about genocide and that section of his speech, the part where he was talking about protecting the American assets there is at least as important and probably more important.
It is. You know, the American embassy in Baghdad is the largest in the world. There's American Apache helicopters now at Baghdad airport, specifically there to be used if Baghdad itself comes under attack, and you have hundreds of Americans potentially. There's talk of, you know, these Islamic State forces trying to encircle Baghdad. So this is it. There's pressure growing on him to act. If he had not acted now, there'd be huge criticism from Republicans, which is to be expected. But I talked to Ambassador Hill and other former ambassadors. There's 4 former ambassadors to Iraq, all calling for this kind of action, airstrikes to stop this force and to do something at this point. I think the president didn't want to do this. He was, you know, under growing pressure, and it's unclear where this goes now and where this ends.
Kristen Welker, is there any word at the White House tonight about how Speaker Boehner reacted when he was informed about this?
Well, we're still waiting to get the specific details of that phone call, Lawrence. We just learned about the phone call, but you heard President Obama say that members of Congress were briefed. As you know, when he was trying to make a determination about how to move forward with Syria, that was a big part of the discussion. Should Congress ultimately be able to have approval and decide whether or not he could move forward with taking some type of measured military action in Syria? So I think that that was certainly a key part of the way that this day unfolded. And again, we are learning that House Speaker John Boehner was briefed. I anticipate that other congressional leaders were briefed as well before President Obama came out tonight. We're still waiting to get reaction. We do know that there have been strong calls from the Hill, though, for some type of intervention, some type of help for those people, those 40,000 people who are stuck on that mountain, stranded there, and who are suffering, who don't have access to food and water. Lawrence?
Ambassador Hill, how would a political change of leadership in Iraq in any way stiffen the spine of even a single Iraqi soldier who's currently in uniform there?
Good question. I think essentially the hope is that the Sunni community, which would include Anbar sheikhs, that is tribal leaders in western Iraq, would be, their morale, their spirit would be greatly heightened by the departure of Maliki. If they could come up with some sort of technocrat who is not known for being a strong sectarian leader, and they could perhaps get a greater sense that they live in the political lifeblood of the country. How that will translate into a recruit in the Iraqi army, and more specifically, how that will translate to Iraqi army officers who need to lead recruits is another matter. The problem has been the Iraqi army has not performed well at all. And so I think we have a serious problem, which probably is not going to be solved just by the Iraqi army or by a political deal in Baghdad. I think we have a problem that's more regional in nature. I think ISIS is not particularly interested in concessions Maliki might make and whether Maliki will give the Sunnis another ministry or something. I think ISIS has a much bigger game in mind, much more regional game, and that's where I think the United States really has to think more broadly about how to solve this.
And David Rohde, ISIS is very clear about their goals, and they're very ambitious.
They're very ambitious, and they're very effective. And one of the amazing things was what they're doing militarily. They're able to move at least 1,000 fighters, and they've now got millions, tens of $millions worth of American military equipment they've captured and bring them to bear. The Peshmerga were seen as the better fighters in Iraq, and they've rolled right through them. Their long-term goal, one of the things they've talked about is this state. They eventually talk about getting and controlling the holy cities in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has activated troops. One former ambassador said to me today, the only thing separating ISIS from these, Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia is desert. That's a long way away. There's talk about Baghdad. They can clearly destabilize the region, though, with what they're doing. And no country right now, particularly the Iraqi state, has the military strength, it seems, to stop them.
Kristen Welker, Ambassador Christopher Hill, and David Rohde, thank you all very much for joining me tonight.